Hello everyone, I've decided to start a new series called Darkrise Builds. In this series, I'll be creating different builds for each class, showing the stats, equipment, skill tree and explain how to build it, and how it would work throughout the game, especially at Fatal Bridge, endgame. I'm doing this because it might give you an idea of how you might want to build your own character, and it's a chance for me to show you some passive skill trees and equipment combinations in a way that makes sense to you. For today's video, I'm going to be looking at an archer build that I call Glass Cannon. The reason I call it this is because it has good damage output but lacks health, making it fragile like glass. Before we continue with that, I just wanted to say that this character is the one that I started Darkrise with, which is why it's level 180. The characters that we look at next will probably be around 160 to 170. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the stats of this, and we're going to start with the general stats. And as you can see, strength is the highest at 10k, and that's good because it means that stats like armor pen, critical severity, block severity are going to be very high. The only problem with this is that obviously if strength is high, dexterity is going to be lower, and dexterity is the damage stat for archer, so damage won't be that high. There's a huge drop off to stamina, and that means my HP isn't going to be very high. Defense might not be that high either. And then we've got intelligence, which is the lowest. It usually is the lowest. However, at 579, it's still pretty chunky. And this might suggest that I'm actually going to use a lot of skills when I'm fighting enemies, which can be useful. So now we're going to be looking at the offensive stats, and damage is at 21.9k, which is pretty good, I would say. I'd say it's pretty good. It's not amazing, but considering I'm focusing on strength, that's fine. Haste, we're looking at 10k, which is fine. That's 223%. Obviously, armor pen, 85.9%. Trying to get high armor pen is so difficult because there's not much armor pen in the passive skill tree, and so you're gonna have to, if you want a high armor pen, you're really gonna have to focus on the equipment, having a lot of armor pen. Critical rate standard 100%, which is not surprising. Critical severity is really important because it's what determines the bonus damage that you do when you do a critical hit, and mine is 1.4k, 1488, and that's great because it means that when I crit, the damage that I do on top of the damage I already have is quite high. Skill recovery, control power, not really important. So we're going to look at the defensive stats now, and as you can see, my health is really low. It's only 79k. It's not even 100k, which is quite low. And as a result of that, when you see the gameplay of Fatal Bridge, you'll see that I'm really cautious, and that's why this build is called Glass Cannon. Magic Shield is 0. Health regen is 5k, which is actually pretty high. You don't need it that high. Defense is 84%, so it's not bad. It's not the highest, but it's alright. Block rate is at 100%, pretty standard for endgame. Block severity is very high, it's at 92%, so maybe you don't call this build a glass cannon. I still think it's a glass cannon, but I do have block severity very high, so as a result of that, I still will be able to do stuff like Fatal Bridge. And then we're looking at the intelligence stats. Mana is at 456, which is actually pretty high considering it's an archer. So as a result of that, I will be able to use a lot of skills. Mana regen's alright, 18 per second. Mobility 250k, and obviously EXP. So those are the stats. We're now going to be looking at the equipment. So we're going to start with Samurai Helmet, and Samurai Helmet has strength, dexterity, defense, block rate, crit rate, damage, and obviously it's a unique item, so they're all yellow stats. Samurai Plate, obviously exact same stat, and they make up the Samurai set, so I get bonus of strength and dexterity. My Gauntlet has a lot of critical severity. There's health regen too, but that's not very useful, but the critical severity is, which allows me to have higher critical severity. My bow has armor pen, critical rate, damage, 2 damage stats, which is obviously quite useful considering my dexterity is a bit lower than usual. Uh, Obviously my Powderons have critical rate, block severity, which obviously can be quite useful. Control resistance isn't very useful. My pants actually have all yellow stats, but it's not a unique, which is quite nice. Again, block severity. I'll be honest, Defender's Path, I only use it because there's no real other options, no real alternatives. And actually there's a lot of health on there, which means that if I didn't use it, my health would be even lower. Which is quite funny there. And of course my Quiver, which has a lot of armor pen, which again raises my armor pen. The look to rings, and my first ring's actually really good. It's all yellow stats. I'm really happy with this ring, and it has armor pen, it has critical severity, block rate, 2 critical severity stats, all yellow stats, which is nice. And my last ring isn't as good, it has armor pen, some useless stats like health regen. But yeah, and for one thing you'll realize is that all the gems are strength, which means I'm really trying to push the armor pen, critical severity, block severity. The last thing we're going to look at is my passive skill tree, and the first thing that you'll notice is that there's barely any critical rate or block rate. And this is why when people ask for my passive skill tree, I don't want to give it to them, because if you just looked at this without looking at my equipment as well, chances are you wouldn't have enough block rate and critical rate. Now I don't need block rate and critical rate from this skill tree because my equipment gives me enough, so I can focus on other areas. But when you start the game, you're probably going to need to use the skill tree to give you the block rate, to give you critical rate, and then later as your equipment improves, you would then obviously reset your skill tree and take some block rate and critical rate away. My skill tree is focused mainly on strength and giving me armor pen, block severity, critical severity, damage as well. And you can also see that at the top that there is also mana as well. I'm getting mana for myself, intelligence for myself, so I can use my skills more often. You can also see that there's barely any stamina, which is another reason why my health points are so low. But there is the passive skill tree. With all that being said, it's time to look at the good things and the bad things about using this build and see whether or not it could work in an endgame map. Now in the background you'll see some footage of this archer doing Fatal Bridge without any potions at all, and it's really important that you pay attention to it because the way I play Fatal Bridge is heavily reliant on the build, and I'll keep referring to it throughout the video. Now one good thing about the glass cannon build is that it really uses Archer's main advantage, which is range. Obviously it can hit enemies from really far out, farther than any other class, and this also means that it naturally takes the least hits. Now if you're not getting hit by an enemy, you don't need high defensive stats, and with this build you're sacrificing defensive stats for damage output, so you'll be sweeping through maps, killing, one-shotting enemies, and for most of Darkrise maps you can do this. Archer can use its range to its advantage, and so a glass cannon build can be very dangerous. Another good thing about this is that it is an achievable build because there are lots of equipment that have offensive stats. Your helmet could have offensive stats, gauntlets tend to have offensive stats, of course your bow will have offensive stats, Powderons will have offensive stats, quivers have offensive stats, and you can also get offensive stats on your rings as well. So there are lots of chances and lots of areas where you can add an offensive stat, making sure that you can get as much damage, critical rate, armor pen, critical severity in there as you possibly can. And finally, being able to sweep across maps as you're one-shotting enemies is much more better for farming than slowly grinding at enemies and killing enemies one at a time really slowly. So you'll probably have more fun that way as well, and you'll save more time. There are obviously some problems with this build, and the biggest problem with a glass cannon build is the fact that you're going to struggle to do Bridge of Stagnation. This is because unlike most areas where the enemies are only coming at you from one direction, in Bridge of Stagnation they're coming at you from both sides, and so you can't use your range as much as you would like to. You're going to get surrounded and you're going to get hit, and this is a problem for you because obviously you're using a build that has low HP, less defense, and so as a result you're going to be more likely to die, which obviously isn't good. So as a result of that, a glass cannon build probably requires you to be more high level than other builds to pull it off, and you're going to need to be more cautious when you're playing as well. So how would I build a glass cannon? I mean, you'd probably start building your character like you usually would, like leveling up, etc. I think your passive skill tree at first will have a lot of critical rate and block rate, and you'd have a lot of dexterity gems because obviously you're an archer. Dexterity equals damage, block rate, critical rate, etc. Obviously over time you'll start swapping out the gems for strength to get the armor pen, critical severity, block severity. By 140, you should have like almost all your gems at mythical, and almost all your enchantments should be at almost plus 20. My biggest advice is when you first start trying to do Fatal Bridge, don't use a glass cannon build. Try and use a balanced archer that has, good amount of health as well, because you're going to want to last as long as you can and get as much XP as you can. It's only when you're happy with your progress that you start slowly changing into a glass cannon build. So the big question that you all have in your mind is, can this build do Fatal Bridge? And the answer is it can, but it's really difficult because the low health is going to be really annoying when the enemies reach level 185 plus, because at that point they have the ability to just one-shot you. So when you're doing Fatal Bridge as a glass cannon, firstly you need to be really, really careful. If you see an elite enemy, don't run towards it. Don't try and tank the damage because you can't tank it. You're going to die. I would try and use my range as much as I possibly can to kill it from afar. You also need fast reactions as well, because if you see an elite, you want to start like doing a lot of damage, maybe using like multi-shot and barrage as fast as you can to kill it as quickly as possible before it reaches you. You're also going to need a whole lot of luck as well. If 2 Thunder Knights spawn either side of you, rest in peace. Also, if you're someone that doesn't like to move, then I wouldn't recommend glass cannon, because you're going to want to move, because there's going to be points where you're going to want to run. So if you don't like moving, I wouldn't use a glass cannon build. Do I recommend a glass cannon build? It depends. If you're someone that isn't doing Bridge of Stagnation, then I would, because in the other maps, an archer could use its range as much as it wants, so you're not going to get hit that much, so you might as well maximize your damage. If you're like a really high level character, like 175 plus, then I would also recommend it, because Darkrise can get boring because there's nothing to do, so you might as well make it as challenging as possible. And a glass cannon build is definitely challenging, but also quite fun. But if you're someone that likes to be more passive, likes to be more slow, is trying to do Bridge of Stagnation consistently on Fatal difficulty, then I wouldn't. I would instead recommend a more balanced class with more health, because that way you're probably going to be more guaranteed to do Fatal Bridge consistently. I guess that's the end of the video for me. If you still want to keep watching my Fatal Bridge run to the end, then be my guest. I end up dying at like 195, but it's a good example of a Fatal Bridge run on a glass cannon build. If you don't want to watch, that's fine. Thank you for watching this video. If you like what you saw, you found it useful, consider subscribing and liking, and I will see you in the next video.